I can't wait for you to hear today's conversation when Jeff and I interview Gary Thomas. He is a best-selling author of over 20 books. We dig into two of them today, Sacred Marriage and Marriage Sex. Both had significant impacts on our own marriage. Gary is the teaching pastor at Cherry Hills Christian. He has led marriage seminars for many years. He's married to Lisa for over 40 years. He's a marathon runner and gives so much wisdom in today's conversation. I've got a question for you. Who's the person you're being? Are you satisfied? It's okay. This is a judge-free zone, and it's exactly why I started the show. Welcome to Be the Person, a podcast for the brave and the curious who are ready to explore who they are fully created to be. I'm your host, Annie Randall, the adventurous one leading this investigative journey of transformation. By delving into topics and asking unexpected questions, we will discover the keys for unlocking our true potential and being our best selves today. You may be surprised by what you find when you let go of fear in order to discover the answers of becoming the person you were made to be. Welcome to Be the Person podcast. I am so excited to have an author, speaker, teaching pastor at Cherry Hills, somebody who has made a difference in Jeff and I's life, and Gary Thomas. Welcome to the show. We are super excited to have you here today.
Well, I'm really honored to be a part of it. Thank you.
And I'm excited too that I have my husband Jeff here to do the interview with us because it's all about marriage. And so we each have some questions for you and excited just to jump right in.
Sure.
Okay. One of your books, Sacred Marriage, it was a study that we did early on in marriage. And we actually pulled out the study guide to get ready for this, which was fun to see. And I remember it having such an impact on me and my view of marriage because it's all based around the question, what if God designed marriage to make you more holy than happy? And honestly, I had never thought of that before. And I was just curious. It was a new thought for me. I'm guessing it was a new thought for a lot of people that read the book. Do you feel like God put that on your heart, or how did that concept come to you to write the book?
Yeah, I do. I'd written 3 books on spiritual formation. One was on the wisdom of the Christian classics. One was on different pathways of worshiping God. One was on practicing the virtues. But I began to notice that nothing was challenging me in my faith quite like my marriage. And I don't mean to make that sound negative. Just I was seeing my sin. I was seeing an opportunity to grow in service, the importance of growing in gentleness, compassion, courage, all the virtues of Christ, the fruit of the Spirit. And I'd never seen somebody approach marriage from that end. I love to read the Christian classics, but most of the Christian classics are written by monks and nuns, for monks and nuns. And the notion is that if you could sort of imitate our way of life, long solitary retreats and this and that, you can kind of grow like we do. And I felt like, well, if I were to go to my wife and say, hey, honey, I want to get closer to God this weekend, so you watch the 3 kids and I'm going to go off to a prayer retreat for the entire weekend. It might sound good to me, not so much to her, but then I realized, but nothing will challenge your patience. Back then, getting in a minivan with 3 kids and driving across the state, nothing feels like it confronts some of the issues that you have in your life that you don't realize, quite like marriage. And so I wrote it out of my limitations. I'm not a marriage therapist. I'm not a licensed counselor, but just recognizing how God used my marriage to shape me is where I went. So I initially looked at it as a spiritual formation book more than a marriage book, but that difference seemed to make it stand out and kind of helped it take off.
And how have you seen it change your own marriage over the years?
Well, I think appreciating the process of marriage, things that I might have resented before, that now I recognize this is one of the purposes of marriage. I remember right after 9/11, I was traveling so much before then, almost every weekend. And then 9/11 hit and we went, just a long time. They shut down. And uh, that's when they instituted TSA and you have the long lines. And sometimes it would take an hour and a half, 2 hours to get through security because they were just figuring things out. It's one thing if you do that once a year when you're going on vacation. When you're doing it every weekend, I was getting less and less patient. After a few times of this, Lisa was traveling with me. I remember going through the line and I'm just kind of frustrated. It's taking so long and it's consuming so much time. And we got through and Lisa looked at me. She goes, Gary, I don't recognize you in this line. You tend to be a guy that's open to others and polite, and you're just kind of pushing through and you're just a little bit curt and whatnot. That's just not who I've known you to be. And it would have been easy for me earlier in my marriage to say, well, you don't know what it's like going through this every week, or how dare you judge me, or why don't you respect me? And then I realized she's right. And that's not the person I want to be. And I'm grateful for her, not just as my wife, but as my sister in Christ, to say, Gary, you're not using an opportunity. What if God wants you to be his representative in this 2 hour long line? What if you're to have conversations? What if you're to pray for some of the TSA personnel instead of sitting there judging them? And I just looking at marriage through that lens, instead of this becoming a marital fight, I could be grateful that, okay, this is one of the reasons that God has called me into marriage and really learned to appreciate it. I think another thing is I got married so young. I was 22. I may have been the most selfish person on the planet. I had idealistic notions about what marriage would be and what I would get and all the happiness it would bring. And I think God so changed my heart through looking at marriage through his lens that I can honestly tell you today, some of the greatest pleasure I get is serving my wife and meeting her needs. She has what she calls her magic gas tank. She's a very holistic person, maybe the healthiest eater in the world. She won't use a lot of substances on her skin like people do. So there's nothing about a gas station that she can even stomach. So doesn't bug me. I'm determined to fill up her gas tank all the time so that hopefully she'll never have to fill up another gas tank the rest of her life. And it's almost selfish because I get a great joy knowing that I'm able to do this for my wife, where she just really doesn't like to do it. That's a change that God wrought in my heart. It's a different way of looking at marriage now than I did when I first got married.
Yeah, I love that.
I love that. That brings up a topic that I think it was in one of your marriage seminars that we attended, and it was all about intimacy.
Mhm.
And it was just being fully known, because your wife knew who you really were in that TSA line, but choose to love you through that.
Yes.
So that was not scripted or anything, but that just really stood out to me for sure.
Yeah.
Can you think of any other examples, as far as with people that you've kind of, I don't want to say counseled, but worked with through your
Yeah.
pastoral ministries, that this idea from happiness to holiness
I,
stood out?
Yeah, I think Rhett and Christy are a great example. Rhett was in his 30s before he got married. Brilliant lawyer, great Bible study teacher. He had a good mind. He would never fall into heresy. He knew his theology, even though he was a lawyer. He married a wonderful woman who was vibrant and extrovert and full of life and whatnot. And about 3 years into their marriage, she got really sick. She had a medical issue they had to take care of. And the doctors called him in and said, look, guys, I just want to tell you, here's what's going to happen. This is the operation, but you've got to be prepared because it's going to be at least a month of bed rest for Christy to come back from that. And they were leaving the doctor's office and they were in the car, and Rhett looked at Christy and said, honey, I don't know if I can do this. And Christy's mystified. What do you mean? I'm the one getting the operation. He goes, I know, but you've always been so low maintenance. I know I'm high maintenance. Tank, our dog, is high maintenance. The only reason this family works is because you're low maintenance. What happens when that changes? And it struck me out. Christy gave him glowing accords. She said he stepped up to it. But Rhett had to realize Jesus wasn't just a teacher. Jesus cared for people. Jesus was a healer. And if Rhett wanted to become more like Jesus, he needed to learn what it means to have compassion, to be Nurse Rhett for a while, to do that. And he didn't get married for that. He married Christy for the exact opposite reason. I know as a lawyer, I kind of like this and that. I'm high maintenance. She's low maintenance. God had a different agenda. Rhett, I want to fill you out. I want you to become more like my son. And there's some areas where you really lack. You're not going to be caught by heresy, but are you a servant like Jesus? Do you have the compassion of Jesus? And I think if we go into marriage recognizing that we're not there yet, that God is working on us, that as Paul says to the Corinthians, we need to perfect holiness out of reverence for God. The whole verse is, dear friends, let us purify ourselves from everything that contaminates body and spirit, perfecting holiness out of reverence for God. So not just the gross sins, it says everything that contaminates body and spirit. The attitudinal sins. Maybe somebody's just negative. Maybe somebody is judgmental. Maybe somebody is harsh. Maybe somebody isn't kind. All of those things that, it's we don't often recognize how much of the world is still in us. But when marriage represents like this big mirror in front of us, this is who you really are. We get a chance to look into it. And by the mercy of Jesus, know that we can confess our sin because Jesus promises to forgive us and to send his Holy Spirit to help us change. So instead of saying, why does this have to happen in my marriage? It's like, oh, God could really use this challenge in my marriage to help accomplish a great end for me to become more like Christ, i.e., to become holier.
Yeah, such a good way to look at it, and such an opposite of how in this world that we don't want to look at it. It's so much easier, I know it has been for us to be like, why did that happen or what happened here? But instead of, like you said, using it as a mirror to be like, how can this really change me? One of your books that really also made an impact, and I have it here. We listened to the Audible, which was fun together. We commuted to Colorado Springs, was Married Sex, and really appreciated it because you wrote it with Deborah Folletta. And I love the perspective because one, it was male, female. It was, you guys have been married different amounts of time. You're different ages. She's a counselor, you're a pastor and author. So there were so many different dynamics, I felt like, in that book. Why did you decide to write it? And what did you really hope couples would walk away with?
Well, there were a number of national marriage ministry leaders that were just telling me, Gary, we need a new book for evangelical Christian couples on sex. The ones that had been known could be 30 or 40 years old that they were using. Others were just really male-centric, and the guys liked them, but the wives were kind of frustrated. But I thought to avoid that, I didn't want to write it on my own. And I read a number of Deborah's work. She's a counselor. I really admired her. I thought she was a great writer. And so I approached her and said, so here's the challenge. Is this something you'd like to do together? And I was really thrilled that I did it that way because I think Deborah knocked it out of the park. And everything you said is why we did that. Different stages of marriage. You can forget what it's like early on in marriage. She doesn't know yet what it's like when you've been married 40 years. A woman's perspective, a man's perspective, a counselor's training, a pastor's training. And really the book tries to address the 5 main roadblocks that keep sex from thriving in a marriage. First one is theological, which I was able to do just through exegesis, showing, and I think we'll get into that later, just how pro-sex God is and Scripture's embracing of it within marriage. But then there's the relational aspect. A lot of times issues in the bedroom aren't about techniques or physical performance. They're relational issues. If there is anger and a lack of forgiveness or manipulation or coercion or whatnot, that can stop what's happening in the sexual relationship. Third are psychological roadblocks. And as a counselor, Deborah was great at this. Maybe you're dealing with shame. Maybe you're dealing with past guilt. Maybe you've got a repugnance toward or whatnot. Those are psychological issues that need to be addressed. The fourth one is the physical roadblocks. And Deborah told me how shocked she is some couples, particularly if they grew up within the church, completely ignorant about the physical parts of a male body and a female body. And they just felt like you weren't supposed to discuss it. And so we have a chapter, What Gets Him Going, that I write, just trying to explain to wives how guys tend to be. And Deborah has a chapter, What Gets Her Going, explaining to guys about how to help women. Now, every woman is different and every man is different, but the idea is that by reading through it together, as you did, couples can talk about it. Is this true of you, or how is that different for you? The last thing kind of surprised me. We polled or interviewed over 1,000 couples, and it's the whole boredom roadblock. Sex within marriage is something that you are committed to for lifetime with only one person. And when you do anything, I mean, if you play tennis with somebody once or twice a week, every week for a while, I mean, you just kind of get to know what the game is going to be. And so this is where books can be really helpful. We went to these couples. How do these issues that Deborah and I raise, and we talk about simmering in the 5 senses and choose your adventure and different positions. How have you learned to create new times of intimacy and keep the relationship fresh? And by changing the identifying details, we're able to really have a lot of really fresh ideas. I mean, I don't think it's wise for couples in a small group on a Friday night to say, hey, you guys got to hear what we did last night. I mean, it was just this great position. And then she did, I mean, that could get very inappropriate. But in the form of a book, it's able to describe it. Now, what that did do, just fair warning, it did make it a bit more explicit than I thought it would be. I think it stops well short of what I imagine pornography would be like. We're not, getting into that kind of thing, but it is a very clear description of what couples have done to keep things fresh and fun and meaningful, and even sensual. So Deborah and I don't recommend that singles read the book. And if I'm working with an engaged couple, I tell them to wait till maybe the honeymoon or maybe a month before the wedding or whatnot, because so many married couples have told us that reading the book really kind of gets them going. But here's the ultimate end. Am I going on too long?
No,
No,
you're
not at
great.
all.
Here's the ultimate end that hit me. And this is way before we wrote the book, but I remember Lisa and I were a much younger couple. My dad took the entire extended family. He cashed in his retirement on this Caribbean cruise. That was their dream. He cashed in all of his unused sick time. So we were in a cabin with our 2 daughters. My son was with his cousins. And if you've ever been on one of these cruises, number one, the kids have a key card, right? So you can't lock them out, which is a little frustrating. 2, they were just a little too old to where, I mean, they're sleeping 20 inches above you. They bring a bunk down. They're a little too old for us to pretend they might not hear something. It just didn't seem like it would be kind, right? To do that with them in the room. And so it's frustrating because out the whole week, we just want to act like a married couple because it's such a romantic vacation. You're taking off from Miami and the sun is setting and they're playing reggae music and everybody's in beach clothes. And we were just thrilled to be together. But we wanted to act like a married couple one time on that romantic vacation. And so the last full day, it was a sailing day. And though my wife is very organic and healthy eating, there was one restaurant on board that had a line. It's called Johnny Rockets. And they had hamburgers and hot dogs and ice cream and milkshakes and whatnot. And we thought we would use the fact that there was a long line, because remember, the girls have a key card. So we got in line and I said to the kids, all right, your mother and father have an errand to run, which was true. I just want to make it clear, you will not leave this line until we make it back. Is that understood? Okay, fine. Now, if you get to the front of the line and we're still not back, I go, just go ahead and take a seat, because if you try to find us, you might go up this staircase and we're coming down that one and we'll lose our place in line. So just want to make it clear that you'll go ahead and be seated even if we're not back. And that, okay, that's fine. I thought for a second, I go, now, if you finish your meal, I mean, it'd been all week. We didn't want fast food, right? I go, you can get whatever you want. If you want to get a banana split, you want to get a float. I said, I will buy you this boat if you just promise me you're going to stay here until we get back. And I said, sure. At least I went back to the room and honestly don't remember what happened in that stateroom. And if I did, I wouldn't recount it. But I remember that evening afterwards. It was the smiles that Lisa and I had. And this is what I love about physical intimacy within marriage. We were able to do it. We enjoyed each other. We had all of the good feelings you have after an encounter like that. Now we were thrilled to be with our kids instead of trying to get away from them. We were happy to be back together. And it's just a secret that just us know, and now all of your listeners, basically, that we were able to share this time and really be thrilled as a married couple. And for me, writing Married Sex was about not just the pleasure of the moment, but those smiles. Maybe a couple going to church, to be honest, or maybe a couple going to a family gathering, or they wake up on a Saturday morning or whatnot, and it's such a private thing. It's personal. No one will ever know. But it's not just the moment. It's the smiles afterward, what it does for the relationship. I want to create those marital smiles that Marital Sex does such a good job of bringing up and renewing again and again.
Yeah. Such a good story. I love that. I can just picture the kids in line. But I do appreciate how open and honest that you both were. And that really sucks as an opportunity rather than an obligation. Because I think sometimes in marriage that can be something that comes up, but really that you want couples to have this strong sexual relationship in marriage because it makes your marriage better.
Yes.
What do you really think like God wants couples to know about marriage? Because I don't think a lot in the church or as couples, like you said, it's not something you bring up on Friday night with other couples. But what do you think God really wants us to know about it?
Well, first, that he's a fan. It's astonishing how strong the biblical record is on God being pro-marital sex, sex within marriage. And, it just begins with the title of the Song of Songs, one book that has an exclusive focus on the erotic relationship between a husband and wife. I read that book like most modern commentators, that it's not a chronology. It's not the story of one couple. Far more, it's the story of an act, the marital act. And there are other people referred to. And I think that's what makes it so powerful when you look at the title, the Song of Songs. Something of something is an ancient Near Eastern phrasing that elevates what's being discussed. It's like we call God the King of Kings. It doesn't mean he's just the wisest of kings or the mightiest kings. It means if you were to put all the kings of the universe together, God would be king of those kings. And so when you have a book that is celebrating the marital act, calling it the Song of Songs, saying that there is nothing else like this, is a sermon in itself. And if we're honest, it shouldn't surprise us. The fact that through sex, we can create people, human beings that share our DNA, is just astonishing. What we know it does to the brains, releasing oxytocin, helping us to fall in love with each other over and over again, is amazing. The fact that it reminds us that we are people made with bodies, with nerve endings, and the pleasure that we can experience by God's design, the spiritual analogies it represents. There's so much that it offers that really nothing else in human experience does. It shouldn't surprise us that God describes this book as a Song of Songs. So first thing I think that is huge is he's a fan. The second thing that astonished me is how well-rounded this book was. It was written over 3,000 years ago. The very second verse in the Song of Songs talks about the woman declaring that, kiss me with the kiss of your mouth, for your love is greater than wine. We don't understand the power of that because we're so far removed from that. But I want you to go back 3,000 years and imagine how many pleasures a woman 3,000 years ago living in the desert didn't have. I mean, almost nothing that a woman has today. She didn't wake up in a bed. She couldn't have cappuccino or Americano in the morning. They didn't even have Folgers coffee back then. There was no dark chocolate. That would have melted. And I can't even imagine my wife's life without dark chocolate. And at the end of the long day, there was no, Real Housewives of Jerusalem to chill out and laugh at others and whatnot. They had very few pleasures except for one, and that was wine. So she's literally saying, when my husband makes love to me, because that your love is better than wine, that's Dod in Hebrew, D-O-D. It's not romantic love. It's physical love making. She's saying, I have no higher pleasure in life than when my husband is making love to me. Now, women today may not feel that way because they have a lot of pleasures to choose from. I'm not trying to say women should feel that way. What I am trying to say is that God's revelation makes it very clear that he designed sex for the woman's pleasure as much as for the man's. It's not that she's there to service him or to keep him from sinning, that the Bible celebrates that a woman was made to receive sexual pleasure in the act of lovemaking with her husband. And I just love how this book just so predates so many of the conversations we have now. And then the way that a man's sexual desires are celebrated. When he says, I liken you, my darling, to a mare harnessed to one of the chariots of Pharaoh. The only reason they would harness mares to the Pharaoh's chariot was to get the stallion sexually excited. And so it's an expression of him, when I'm in a sexually fulfilling relationship with you, I can do more, I can be more. And every study backs that up. Men who are in that kind of relationship with their wife tend to be better connected with their children, more relationally connected with their wives. I think they tend to be better workers. And I would make the case that they're freer to be better worshipers. And it's not just that God creates sex for the wife's pleasure and for the husband's pleasure, but he talks about the freedom for us to give ourselves thoroughly over to the act. In Song of Songs 5:1, he says this, eat your fill, O lovers, be drunk with love. And it's a sense of, I want you to feast on your desire for each other. Let yourself be intoxicated with your passion. Now, if it's a healthy marriage, I think there are those moments in the bedroom where you just feel carried away by your desire for that person. Within marriage, that's a holy thing. Within marriage, it not only pleases each other, it honors God. It's literally the picture of God looking at a couple in the act of lovemaking. And he's not shaming them. He's not saying, well, can you develop Yahtzee? Maybe you should invent Scrabble. He's saying, hey, you're doing what I created you to do. I want you to feast on this moment. I want you to let yourself be intoxicated by your passion for each other. God knows that marriage has many trying times. I think every marriage has moments of difficulty throughout itself. But God also says, and in the midst of that, I want to give you moments of ecstasy. In the married sex book, I have a whole chapter called Engedi about the oases that marital sex can represent, where life is hard. It feels like a desert. You go to the oasis of marital intimacy. You get refreshed, you get water, you get renewed to go back out into the desert until you get to the next oasis. And I think when we realize that God created it for a purpose, yes, to have children, yes, to enjoy pleasure, but also yes, for what it does for our bond as husband and wife, because there really is nothing else like it, neurologically, physically, and spiritually, to keep reuniting us as lovers and as spouses.
Yeah, so good. So good. So many things I didn't know in there that you pointed out too.
Gary, any thoughts on why sex can be such a hard topic to discuss, even with your spouse?
Yeah, I had at first, it was an alarming call right after Married Sex came out, because I have a very close friend who I just so admire and respect. He's got a PhD in counseling. He studied under Dr. Larry Crabb, very thoughtful. If I have couples that are really in trouble, I often send them to him. And he talked about how disturbing the book was for him. I thought, oh no, did I mess up? I mean, I would totally accept his criticism. He goes, no, I just mean talking about these things so frankly, it gets at these root issues. It gets at our fears. It's like he's calling us into the light. Do I really want to talk about this with my wife? And I thought if it was disturbing for him, who has spent decades talking to married couples, who has gone through a PhD program, who I think is as in tune with what it means to be a human and a husband and a believer as anyone, then it's like, well, it's going to be difficult for all of us because we all have this narrative of what's happened in our past, of how we look at ourselves. We're scared of the desire. There's shame that most of us deal with, their guilt or whatnot. So I was very pleased to realize he thought, no, this is a great book. I wish every couple would read it. But it was sobering to realize that even for somebody I think is one of the healthiest friends I know, still found it to be disturbing just for the unrest it created dealing with these issues in such an upfront manner.
Yeah, because I think regardless, whether you're just getting married or you've been married a long time, it can raise some hard conversations because, like you said, it was those 5 pillars, and probably one of them for all of us can be difficult to discuss, if not all of them.
Absolutely.
What about seasons? In the Bible, it talks a lot about seasons.
Yeah.
Do you see this in marriage? And do you believe like your sex life goes through seasons as your marriage does as well?
Yeah, it's a great follow-up to what we just talked about because the reality is that sex is different throughout life. I love this metaphor that Dr. Julie Slattery gives. She said that marital sex is more like a Lego set than a Tonka truck. And guys will get this because when you get a Tonka truck for Christmas, you take it out of the box and it's good to go. You're moving dirt, you're rolling around and whatnot. A Lego set is designed for something entirely different. The fun is in putting it together. But once you put it together, you got to tear it apart and rebuild it. Because who wants to play with a Lego boat for more than 5 minutes? It would be very boring. And the challenge, I think, for married couples is when they're first becoming intimate, sexual chemistry is like infatuation. Now, not for every couple. Some couples can really struggle even in their honeymoon, but for a lot of couples, desire is there. It's exploring, it's new, it's fun, it's fresh. But like infatuation, sexual chemistry won't keep the sexual relationship going. So it's going to be very different once it starts to feel routine. And young husbands are often shocked at how quickly marital sex can start to feel like a routine. And then when you get into the childbearing years, it's entirely different. When a mom is pregnant or she's nursing or raising kids and the tiredness that represents, there's a different season when the kids get a little bit older and they're teenagers. And if you're like my wife and I, and you can't afford a bigger house, you're sharing a wall with a daughter who stays up later than you do, which makes things complicated. Then there's a season of when you become empty nesters or become senior citizens, and there can be age-related issues or disease-related issues. And the whole point about Julie Slattery's analogy is you've got to keep tearing apart your sex life and rebuilding it. Because the sex that you had in your 20s may not sustain you in your 30s, and yet may not in your 40s and 50s, and may be done in your 60s and 70s. Now, I've talked to couples in their 70s where it is still a supremely satisfying force of intimacy well into their 70s. And a lot of Christian sex therapists will tell me that the golden years of a couple's sexual relating occurs after about 20 years of being together. And there are reasons for that. The problem is, if couples don't understand the pattern of seasons that you raise, they think, well, we don't desire each other like we used to. We don't have it as often as we used to. So the spark is gone, or maybe we've fallen out of love. They don't realize that a good sex life isn't something you find, it's something you make, and you have to keep making it. There are different things, there are different challenges in every stage of marriage. And part of the purpose behind the book, Married Sex, is to tell people why they should care. Because I think it does such wondrous things for a marriage. it's worth it to say, okay, and maybe a lot of listeners and viewers are in this place. We've just kind of let it slide. We haven't given it any thought. We haven't been intentional. And Christians can be the worst at this because they think, well, maybe God doesn't really want us to. They have theological hangups and whatnot. And so it's just sort of died down. And I think, so maybe we just need to learn to live without it. I want to give couples a new vision of the powerful force this can be. Dr. David Schnarch is, he died a couple of years ago, really one of the leading academic sexual therapists in the country. I mean, licensed counselors and whatnot would relate to his works and reference his works. And he divided couples into 3 groups. There's a sexually barren, where he described that would be sex 10 times a year or less. Now, some might say, well, that's not barren, it's 10 times, but he would say it's so far below what most marriages need for sex to be a positive force for good that he treats that as a sexually barren marriage. Then there's a sexually average, and that's where the vast majority of us exist. It's not that sex is bad or good. It happens. Sometimes it's spontaneous. Sometimes it's been a while, but we just do it. And maybe there's just physical urges. And when the physical urge is there, we enjoy each other and whatnot. But then Snarch represents this 3rd group. And that's what I really want people to consider. And partly why we wrote the book. He calls them the blessed few, the blessed few. And he would put that about 8 to 15%. And those are couples who through the years have figured out this can be an incredible force of intimacy, not just pleasure, but the intimacy it brings to a marriage. And I would say for Christians, the spiritual connection it brings to a marriage, the way we understand that God created this, that God smiles on this, and that God created us with bodies that have nerve endings. God designed marriage. God designed sex, not just for procreation, but for all that it does for our minds and for our relationship. And just to step back and say, is it a season for us to be in the blessed few, where sex is this uniting force? It keeps renewing our love. It's a growing thing of enjoyment and intimacy. And what I love about the blessed few, there isn't a certain number of times of sex to be called the blessed few. What matters more is that both spouses feel satisfied and fulfilled and honored and pleasured. So it might not be much more than once or twice a month. If both partners are okay with that, they can still be part of the blessed few. Now, let me also give a caveat. If a husband is listening or watching to this and his wife has just given birth to a baby and they have a couple toddlers, probably not the best time to say, hey, what do we have to do to join the blessed few? But you talk about the seasons of marriage, and this is what I love. And I'm looking back as a guy who will be married 40 years next month. There are a lot of different seasons of marriage, times when you can focus on this and concentrate on that and focus on this and then come back to that at the end. And so I think it's just recognizing the possibilities, enjoying the season you're in, and then just making the most of it with the one life that you have.
So good. And such a great analogy of whatever season you're in, of just enjoying that, but also having something to strive for, to know that there's more.
Yeah, absolutely. You've touched on it a little bit, Gary, but would you have any advice, or would your advice change with regards to newly married couples or couples with toddlers or even empty nesters?
Yeah. When I would talk to newly married couples or couples about to get married now, and what I would stress, I don't know how explicit I can get here on your thing.
You need to. You're okay.
But I would tell the men in particular, stop thinking of sex as a synonym with sexual intercourse. Men are often thinking that's sex. And the honeymoon and the early years of marriage are about figuring out what kinds of pleasure your spouse can enjoy that goes beyond it. That's a very nice part of sexual relating. It shouldn't be seen as the exclusive part. And it's just about learning about each other's bodies, because we just have this notion that sex equals intercourse, And so instead of enjoying the journey, it's like, what's the bare minimum I have to do to get to the main show, which often isn't the most exciting part to the wife in many circumstances, depending on the wife. So I think that the early years are finding out, how does your spouse receive pleasure? And this is so key. I hope people are entering marriage never having been with someone before sexually. But even if they have, let's say a guy has pleased 10 women before and he thinks he's a good lover. I mean, that's not a healthy situation, but just for the sake of argument, that doesn't mean he knows anything about pleasing his wife, because her brain is different. Her body is different. And sex should be very different. It's not about being sexual athletes. We don't have little people with scorecards like we're in the Olympics holding up a 8 or a 9, evaluating what's happening in the bedroom. It's about what pleases your wife, and for wives, what pleases your husband. Because if you try to please your wife like most women like to be pleased, but she doesn't, you can do great damage to your wife. And you can't know that until you're there and exploring and talking about it and figuring it out, how that works. And so we have the chapter, I think, that is really great for that is the chapter on the 5 senses. The Song of Songs celebrates how all 5 senses come into play in a gourmet sexual experience. Couples talk about how they use the power of scent, which can really have a big impact on the sexual relationship. The power of sight and what that means for both husband and wife. The power of sound. The sound that you have going on can create an entirely different dynamic within that particular lovemaking session. The wife's voice. I talk about 7 different tones in the wife's voice that gives it an entirely different dynamic. Obviously, we think about touch, but not just touch as an act of intercourse, but what does it mean to find those other places to touch? And how do you touch? And understanding that your spouse likes to be touched differently. Women's skin can be 10 times more sensitive than men's, which is why women tend to prefer more foreplay. And it's why often, if you talk to couples, the wife feels like the husband, when he does touch her, is too hard or too forceful. And the husband feels like the wife is too soft, too ticklish. Well, they don't understand that a male body is different than a female body. And so just going through the senses, understanding how it works, getting away from this notion that lovemaking is just about the actual act of intercourse is a great thing for couples to do. For, I would say, couples with young kids, there are different ways of looking at it. We talked to one couple where the guy in his wife's mind was legendary for his stamina. He could go a long time. But when she had, I think they had 3 or 4 kids, and they were very young, she was thinking, the last thing I want is to be pawed at the end of the day when I've had kids hanging on me. She really got into quickies. She would say to him, hey, because she just would feel the physical need. And she'd just say, babe, I just turned the television on. We've got maybe 15 to 20 minutes. Let's get going. And they found, like, for a while that was okay, but it was sort of like fast food. If you're hungry, I know, and you're really into healthy eating, but if you're hungry, maybe you give in to fast food now and then. But if all you're eating is fast food, you're not going to have a healthy body. If all you're engaging in is fast sex, you're not going to have a healthy relationship. So we have a chapter called Sacred Simmering. And again, this is modeled in the Song of Songs, even though it's become a favorite practice of sexual therapists, about how you prepare yourself throughout the day so that you're not trying to go from ice cold to white hot just because this is the time of week you're supposed to do that. There are things that are biblically prescribed to awaken our minds, our hearts, and when we do that, to awaken our bodies to receive and experience great sexual pleasure. So there's a place for quickies when the kids are young and you're just kind of meeting each other's physical needs, but take the time, get away. I think there should be weekends. I think one couple I heard of, it's just brilliant. They go to a hotel once a week. And it's not a super expensive hotel, but they say, you know what? It's cheaper than saving up for a divorce lawyer. Just to know they don't have to worry about sound. They don't have to worry about cleanup. They can focus on each other. Nobody's going to knock on the door. I think that's a really wise thing because, frankly, when you get that out of the way and you have these wonderful times of sexual enjoyment, going back to the Engedi model, you enjoy your kids a whole lot more. You're grateful to come home and be with them when you've been together as a couple. And then I think for, well, let me just say before I go to the older couples, it's fascinating. I just read this last week. Helen Brown Fisher, I've quoted her in some of my books. She's an evolutionary biologist, and she's really looked at the neuroscience behind sexual affection and feelings and infatuation and whatnot. She's studied these. And she was talking about she's single later in life as a senior citizen, and a man she was dating wanted to start becoming physically intimate. And she said, I'm just going to tell you neurologically, if we do that, romantic feelings often follow. Are you willing to risk that? Because you said that's not what you were into. And he said, yeah, I am. And they got married 3 years ago because it kind of worked. Regular sexual contact does create romantic feelings. And so if you've got young kids and you're tired all the time and you're not connecting and then you're not sexually intimate, you shouldn't be surprised if the romantic feelings start to die, but you can revive them. I'm not saying sex alone will do that, but it sure can be a big help. And then later in life, we could talk a whole lot more about that. But one of the things that strikes me is how, if we go back to what we said to newlyweds, that lovemaking shouldn't be synonymous with intercourse. There's so many stories about things that older couples can do, even if one of them can't perform. I mean, I talked to a guy who had prostate cancer, which created real issues and whatnot. There can be issues on the woman's part or whatnot, but they've shown if you will just hold each other naked, a full body naked hug in bed releases all kinds of oxytocin. And there was an image, this was in a different book of mine, and it wasn't about sex, but I thought it was so powerful for this. A friend of mine named Daryl just was a super strong guy. He used to bench press 400 pounds. He got MS. Through the decades, was less and less able to do much. He started out with a cane, then a walker, then a wheelchair and a scooter. And he's at a place now where he can scoot his chair up to the bed and he can lift his torso onto the bed, but he needs his wife to swing his legs over. And he said, sometimes I get sorry for myself and think, why don't I just have her do everything? What does it really matter if I got to do this, if I just do this little bit and then she has to do that? And then he said one of the most profound things I've ever heard about marriage, for sexual intimacy, but far beyond. He goes, Gary, I can probably only do about 20% physically of what I used to be able to do, because he was an accomplished athlete. But I'm determined before God that I will do 100% of that 20%. So I will lift my torso onto the bed, even if I need my wife's legs to go over there. So when I was working, for instance, with a man who had prostate cancer and things were very problematic for him as far as full-blown intercourse goes. And that can change later, but certainly early on. And I said to him, the trap so many couples fall into, if erectile dysfunction starts to happen or there's something like that that's related to an operation, it's easy for a guy in his ego to say, if I can't do everything, I'm not going to do anything. And they make it worse. And what I'm saying, maybe you can only do 20% of what you used to do in bed. Do 100% of that 20%. I explained to him, there are other parts of you that can please your wife very nicely. There are other things you can do to create that special experience, because frankly, your wife, the only holy and sacred place for her to receive sexual fulfillment is with her husband. And just because part of you may not be working that great, there are other parts that you can do as a gift to recognize she's made herself vulnerable to you, and you want to make yourself generous to her.
Love that.
Yeah, really great. I want to bring up one more thing, and this is on your latest book, and it's on busyness. And I know it's something that could come up in your in sex life, but also just in marriage. And for us, this was one of the things that almost killed our marriage. We own businesses and we just went in different directions for a long time. And so it came to a point we had to make some pretty drastic changes. But why do you think it in busyness really hurts so many marriages? And I think in there you refer to it maybe as like the silent killer or something that sneaks up on marriages.
Mhm.
And I know that was the case for us. What do you see or advice you can give there?
Well, I wrote Married Sex with Deborah Fileta. And after I wrote that book, I did a book on my own called Making Your Marriage a Fortress. But one of the chapters features Deborah and her husband, John, and it's on busyness. It talks about the difference. They had a very connected marriage, and yet John was going to med school. He's now an eye surgeon. Deborah was getting her licensed counseling degree. And John laughs at the first year of when they had their baby, every picture of him, he's lying on the couch sleeping with the baby on his chest. Because Deborah would need him to watch the baby while she went off and did something. And then he would start, because he's working, I don't know, 60 to 80-hour weeks with those crazy hours that medical people used to work. I'm not sure if they still do. And it was really a chapter on the need to be intentional. And Deborah and John made some really severe choices saying busyness will kill our affection for each other. And it will. Every couple listening or watching to us, if you let busyness go unchecked, you will fall out of love with each other. You will be frustrated with each other. You'll start to become angry with each other. You'll become bitter and frustrated because marriage has a lot of high obligations. You're committed to serve, to be faithful, to loyal, to love, sacrifice for your spouse. And then when you don't have the benefits of times of laughing together, where you're just having fun, eating a good meal together, not being rushed, but just enjoying it together, that emotional connecting, the connecting spiritually. If you don't have those times, you're going to start to feel distant. And so I think it begins with recognizing I've got to be connected to God first, because for me, I can't love my wife well if I'm not connecting with God. And I say for me, but that's the biblical view. 1 John 4:19, we love because he first loved us. So if I'm not letting God love me, if I'm not letting God speak into my life, if I'm not letting God give me motivation for my marriage, I'm not going to be the husband I need to be. But then secondly, I've got to have time with my wife for all aspects, not just sex, although I think that's part of it. But like I said, having fun together, laughing together, talking, praying, connecting spiritually and whatnot, because that's what will feed your family. If you're spending all of your time with your kids and ignoring your marriage, what's going to happen is ultimately they may face the biggest hurt of all, either growing up with the two emotionally distant parents or two parents who now live in two different houses. Maybe you're not ignoring them for the kids. Maybe you're ignoring them for your vocations. Well, now you're risking them by saying, we're going to end up getting a divorce and split our finances in two and have to live in two houses with two dishwashing machines and laundry machines and whatnot. So it is just foolish not to make the marriage a priority. And then we're with the kids. Certainly that's a season. I'm speaking now as an empty nester. I didn't realize how much of a season it was, how much of life, God willing, you can live after you have kids and that they're no longer in your house. I can hardly believe it, but Lisa and I are now probably going a little bit on close to a decade without having one of our children live with us. And so it's recognized that I've got my priorities in my life and other things have to die. I've just finished a book. I reread it, actually. It's called Essentialism by Greg McKeown. And it just reminded me that there are just a few things I really want to do well. And most of the things that keep me busy, frankly, just don't matter. And so it's about learning where to cheat. That's, to use an Andy Stanley phrase. I found out, I know this frustrates people. I don't think my calling in life is to answer email. So if somebody thinks they have to get an answer from email the day they send me one, they're going to think I'm a terrible person. But I finally realized that if I think I have to spend 3 hours a day on email, that's coming from something else that I really need to do. And I think all of us have to make those choices. What's most essential in our life? For me, Matthew 6:33 is a start. Seek first the kingdom of God Second is Ephesians 5:25. Love my wife as Christ loved the church. Pour myself out then toward my kids and to love others, and then try to figure out the other stuff for whatever time is left.
So good. And I think so helpful. And maybe somebody's listening and they're in that stage, and just saying there's hope, because we were in that stage too of, again, with kids and businesses and just everything going different directions of how do we bring that fun back in? One, how do we have that quiet time to let God speak into each one of us, but also just fun. And I think over the last several years of just reinventing our marriage and making it fun and great again has just been a really great journey.
What I love about that approach is that when your marriage is clicking, every hour of the day is better.
Yeah.
Even if you're not with your spouse, you feel better. You're happier. There's more joy. If the marriage feels distant and you just kind of, Lisa and I are never yellers. We don't scream at each other. We never cut down each other or whatnot, but you're just not connecting. So there's that low level frustration. Every hour is worse, right? Even when you're not with each other, there's just like, it's an overcast day. I think, why do we want to live like that? Let's invest in our marriage and make every hour better rather than let our marriage sour every hour of our life.
Agree.
For sure. Gary, I feel like I'm a guest on Annie's podcast, but I know that she likes to, we got to find a stopping point somewhere.
Yeah.
But I know she likes to wrap up most of her podcasts asking her guests, now, other than the Bible, what is one of your favorite books?
Well, if it's fiction, it would be Susan Howitch's Starbridge series. It's a series of 6 books, kind of connected around the 3 strands of Anglicanism in the 20th century in Great Britain. She is a brilliant writer. She chaired a study of religion and psychology at the University of Cambridge. And I love going through those books. It's hard to stop once I get started.
We'll have to check them out.
Yeah. Partly I asked that because I'm a pretty avid reader and I love to see what other people are reading because it introduces me to things I haven't heard of. Gary, I know so many people are going to have listened today and they're going to want more of you and they're going to want to connect. What is the best way to do that?
I'm most active on Substack. Some people don't know what that is, but it's 3 times a week. I release a blog post and there's a newsletter that comes out. There's a long address. The easiest address for that is connecttogary.com. Connecttogary.com. And that'll take them there where they can subscribe, and you can subscribe for free. There's some on the paid side, but people can't afford that. If they just email us, we'll give them a complimentary subscription. As far as my general website, it's garythomas.com. That has my speaking schedule. It lists all of my books. It's got the handles for social media, although while my assistant posts things for my books on social media, I'm not really interacting with people a lot on that. It's better through Substack.
Okay, great. I'll make sure I link both of those in the show notes. I just want to thank you so much for your time today, for speaking into people, to speaking into Jeff and I over the years of marriage, and then being able to go to some of your seminars has been super helpful for us. So thank you so much for being a guest.
Well, I'm so honored and pleased to get to know you. And as I told you before, I'm so looking forward to diving into some back episodes. It was fascinating when I looked. I just love your approach, what you're doing, trying to lift people up in all areas, which I think is the wise approach, that you're looking at, finances, health, marriage, nutrition, all of those things together. I think it's a brilliant approach, and I really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining Be the Person podcast. And it would mean the world to me if you would leave a 5-star review. And if this is helpful for you and you know married couples that it would be helpful for, please share this episode. Thank you so much.